But we begin at Christmas 1985.
For the past year, I have been struck by the strength of feeling throughout the country in favour of breaking the moulds of Irish politics and giving the Irish voters a new and real alternative.
Just before Christmas 1985, Desmond O'Malley launching the Progressive Democrats. Next from the Morning Ireland archives.
But now, coming up to 8 minutes past 8, here's P.P. O'Reilly to tell us what it says in the papers.
Coincidence? Maybe. But when you contemplate that Dessie O'Malley's Progressive Democratic Party has been launched on a £5,000 overdraft, and contrast that with the richness of both Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, remember that the ESB's Shannon scheme was started on a personal overdraft negotiated with a Limerick bank. The question put in effect in our papers today is this: will the new party be as durable as the ESB's Shannon scheme? 5 of our papers today single out the new party for their first editorials. Other parties, says the Times, have flamed briefly, then gutted, and their little lights have gone out. Will the new party go the same way as Clan na Poblachta and all the others? If, however, his action helps to make more young people vote and think about politics, he will have achieved something. Mr. O'Malley has given us all a Christmas present. What kind of present remains to be seen. In Cork, the Examiner describes the launch of the party as O'Malley's gamble. It's going to be a difficult struggle for him, it says. But, says the Irish News in Belfast, this may mark a decisive turning point in southern politics, away from the Civil War divisions and forward into a future more tolerant and a pluralist Ireland. The Independent attributes courage to O'Malley, and if you get, say, 5 people into the next door, that could play havoc with Fianna Fáil's chances of getting an overall majority.
In fact, the party won 14 seats in its first election.
John Healy, in the Times, is forthright as usual. What new party? I see no new party. I see a Stop Hockey grouping.
And the Irish press was then still publishing.
The Irish press is astonished that the new party has got so much publicity, and then proceeds to give it more than half its leader page, and an editorial which searches in vain for a radical image in the new party, which it claims is more middle class than militant.
23 years later came the call this week by the party's 2 TDs and 2 senators to the wider membership to admit that the party was over.
Hi, Mary. No word going into the meeting now.
Have you made your decision? There'll be a statement issued after the meeting. Thank you very much.
And after the meeting?
We had a choice of allowing our very precious elected members to be picked off the edge of a herd like wounded animals.
4th leader of the party, Kieran Cannon.
Or we had an alternative choice. We had a choice to acknowledge the wonderful, lasting legacy that this party has left the Irish people and the Irish nation.
The last leader, Kieran Cannon, looking back, and this, the first leader, looking forward.
My friends, time and tide are on our side.
And the PDs arguably changed Irish politics. There are 3 big platforms: the consent principle on Irish unity, lower taxes and less government, and support for the liberal agenda were all embraced by Fianna Fáil. They're now mainstream. We hear next from the archives Desmond O'Malley in this interview with Olivia O'Leary, who herself had reported on the early... Desmond O'Malley looked back on his term as first party leader, and this was recorded at a time when the party was still prospering under its second leader, Mary Harney, and when Desmond O'Malley had announced his retirement from politics. Olivia O'Leary introduced him as a man who didn't suffer fools gladly.
Well, at times I sometimes come to the feeling that I'm a bigger fool myself than some of those that I disagree with. But that's a slightly glib way of summarising someone, to say that they don't suffer fools gladly, because that can be a reflection on people. It's some of the foolish, outdated ideas that clearly aren't going to work that I get impatient with. You have to, realise that people have different approaches. And I find it difficult to be impatient of someone who genuinely holds a view, and I know holds it for valid reasons. A lot of views are not held though for valid reasons. You know damn well why they're pursuing the particular line they are. It's very hard to suffer that at times.
Later in the interview, she asked him about the decision by the Progressive Democrats in 1989, after their second election and having lost many seats, going from 14 down to 6, their decision to go into coalition with Charles Haughey's Fianna Fáil.
Even so, despite all your criticisms of Haughey and your opposition to Haughey, by going into government in 1989 with him, you gave him a lifeline that nobody else could have given him. Why?
I possibly gave myself a lifeline too, or my party. If you recall, we lost an awful lot of seats. If we hadn't done it, and it took us 7, 8, 9 days to make up our minds to do it, if we hadn't done it, well, then we'd have had to have a general election again straight away, a month after the previous one. And we'd have been blamed for it because the mathematics, if not the politics, of the election had worked out on the basis that we could form a government with Fianna Fáil. It took us a week of agonising, and I mean not just me personally, but each one of us that was elected and those who were advising us, because we all had the same instinctive feeling, but we came to recognise reality, and you can't throw back into the faces of the people the result of a general election just because you don't totally approve of that result yourself.
Moving on to this broader point then, about power and perhaps how it's changed. How has it changed since 30 years ago when you came into Parliament? Does the Dáil have the power, is it seen to have the power that it had then?
It certainly isn't seen to have it. And you realise increasingly that decisions of a fairly fundamental policy nature are made outside the Dáil.
So we have the social partners making decisions, we unelected. We have the European Commission making decisions, unelected. We have the European Central Bank making decisions, unelected. Has all power practically been sucked away from the Dáil?
A lot of power has been sucked away from the Dáil. A lot of power resides in the government. A lot of power resides obviously in an institution like the Supreme Court. The difficulty is that the only directly elected one is the Dáil. Of the other external bodies that you list, I would think that the European Commission has been one that has been beneficial, and it has tried to reflect, and with some success, democratic concerns. I'd be more worried about the European Central Bank, because that's a much more remote body.
Are you sorry that you never ran for leadership of Fianna Fáil? Would you like to have been Taoiseach?
I never wanted to be for the sake of it, insofar as I did make efforts in that direction. It was more to stop someone else rather than to have myself there. I'd have been perfectly happy to be number 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 to someone else.
Why?
Like Jack Lynch.
Why?
Because I was happy in that situation.
Are you a natural number 2?
I think I'm a natural number 2 or 3 or whatever. I'm not someone that wants to push himself out into the public arena all the time. I value privacy, and that's why I found it difficult during a lot of that time to sort of live with the publicity that you had to live with.
But still, when you look back, if it hadn't perhaps been for Charlie Haughey, in time you might well have become leader of Fianna Fáil and Taoiseach.
I might well have, but you would have had to sort of pay a price for it that it wasn't worth, really. And,
like?
You'd have had to play the game as the boys wrote the rules, you know.
And you don't like that?
No, I don't. I prefer to go by my own instincts. I made the mistake of thinking that the circumstances that led to, the election of previous people in Fianna Fáil might continue, but that wasn't so. The rules changed utterly in the 1970s, and they're never going to change back, and I made the mistake of not recognising that soon enough, I think.
You are retiring at the end of this parliamentary term from politics. If you were making your choice again, would you choose to be a politician?
I think I would. I started as a solicitor, and I spent whatever it was 8 years, I think, practicing. That was interesting, and you get all tied up in it, and I'm sure I'd have spent the rest of my life in it, but looking back on it now, I'm sure I'd have inevitably been very bored. I went from a low-key kind of very pretty private type of profession into a very high visibility one, and then I found myself right in the middle of many of the storms that went on over 3 decades in that. So at least, as the Chinese say, I lived in interesting times.
Desmond O'Malley, first leader of the Progressive Democrats, and interviewed by Olivia O'Leary when he had announced his retirement from the Dáil.